There's a moment in every mother's life when love becomes silent. It doesn't shout through birthdays or graduations. It doesn't demand applause or recognition. It waits quietly in the background until the world tells her she no longer belongs, and she learns that silence can be the loudest thing she has left. Linda Parker stood beneath a marble archway that smelled faintly of roses and expensive champagne. The Grand Crescent Hotel's ballroom shimmered beyond the glass doors, strings of white lights reflecting off crystal chandeliers. Her lilac dress, chosen carefully to match the wedding's lavender and ivory theme, felt suddenly out of place, too plain against the gleam of silk gowns sweeping past her. She tightened her grip on the silver-wrapped box in her hands. The bow had come undone slightly on the drive over. She'd planned to fix it before walking in, but the valet had been too quick, the moment too fast. Now the guard in front of her, broad-shouldered, polite but firm, was shaking his head. "I'm sorry, ma'am," he said, looking down our tablet glowing in his palm. "You're not on the guest list." Linda blinked. "That must be a mistake. She paused, forcing a smile that wobbled at the edges, the groom's mother. The guard frowned, scrolling again. "Name?" "Linda Parker." He hesitated, then turned the screen toward her, showing rows of names highlighted in soft gold. Her name wasn't one of them. "I'm afraid you'll have to speak with the wedding planner." Behind the doors, music swelled, a string quartet easing into the familiar chords of Canon in D. Laughter floated from the ballroom, bright and weightless. Through the crack of the door, Linda saw a flash of her son's face, Ethan, her boy, standing at the altar, handsome in a tailored navy suit. The same suit she'd helped him choose 3 months ago, before the phone calls grew shorter, before his fiancée, Emily, began answering for him. She pressed her palm against her stomach, trying to steady the small tremor that ran through her. "I'm not sure what happened," she whispered. The guard's tone softened, the way people do when they sense something breaking. "Ma'am, I'm just following orders." "Orders?" Linda exhaled slowly, a laugh slipping through her lips, dry, small, the kind that hurts more than tears. "Of course," she said. "Everyone always is." She took a step back, the heels of her shoes clicking faintly against the marble floor. For a moment, she thought someone might appear, Ethan, or maybe Chloe, her daughter, to tell her it was all a misunderstanding. But no one came. The lobby emptied around her like a tide going out. A photographer rushed past, adjusting his camera strap, eyes already on the celebration inside. Not one of them noticed her. Through the glass doors, she caught a glimpse of Emily, tall, radiant, the sort of woman magazines loved. The daughter of George and Margaret Whitmore, real estate magnates with houses in 3 states and connections that stretched further than Linda could ever imagine. Linda had once brought Emily a home-cooked dinner when she was sick. Chicken noodle soup, homemade rolls, lemon pudding. The girl had smiled politely and later told Ethan she preferred Whole Foods catering. Now Emily stood under the chandeliers like she'd been born there. Her hand rested on Ethan's arm with the ease of possession. The officiant smiled and the room leaned in. The world tilted away from Linda. A hotel attendant approached, holding the door open as 2 more guests hurried inside. "Are you coming in, ma'am?" he asked, more out of habit than kindness. Linda shook her head. "No, not tonight." She turned away before anyone could see her eyes glisten. The cool evening air rushed against her face, carrying the faint scent of lavender and rain. Across the street, traffic lights blinked red, green, red again, indifferent to heartbreak. She walked toward the bench near the fountain, sat down carefully, and placed the gift beside her. Her hands trembled as she reached into her purse and pulled out her phone. The screen reflected her face, older than she remembered, lines carved from years of late shifts and missed vacations, of holding her children through fever and fear. She opened her email app, scrolled to the message she'd written 3 days earlier but hadn't yet sent. The subject line read, "For Ethan in case I'm not there." Attached were scanned receipts, tuition payments, hospital bills, the down payment on his first apartment, the one she'd co-signed when no bank would trust a 20-year-old with a dream and a borrowed laptop. There were also legal documents, papers she'd once filed quietly, naming herself a silent partner in the company Ethan started from her garage. He never knew, she didn't want him to feel indebted. But love, she'd learned, leaves traces even when it tries to stay invisible. Linda hesitated over the send button. She could almost hear her late husband's voice, gentle, weary. "Pick your battles, Lynn." But this wasn't a battle, it was acknowledgement. A record that she existed in her son's story, even if he'd tried to erase her name from the guest list. She looked back at the ballroom doors one last time. Through the glass, she saw Ethan lift Emily's veil, saw the guests rise in applause. Her throat tightened. For a moment, she whispered something only she could hear. "Be happy, my boy." Then, with a small sigh, she pressed send. The phone buzzed once, confirmation. The email left her inbox and vanished into the cloud, into the world of unseen witnesses and unerasable records. Linda rose, smoothed her dress, and picked up the silver gift box. She walked toward her car, heels tapping in rhythm with her heartbeat. Behind her, the celebration roared on, oblivious. Inside that room, her son's new life began. Outside, hers did too, quieter, smaller, but maybe freer. As she opened the car door, a drop of rain landed on her wrist. Another followed. Soon, the sky let go, as if granting her permission to do the same. She smiled softly at the absurdity of it all. A mother not invited to her own child's wedding. A woman erased from the picture but still holding the frame. Somewhere in her chest, grief and pride sat side by side, uneasy companions, but hers alone. Before she started the car, she whispered the first lesson she would later write in her journal. When they close the door on you, don't wait outside too long. Sometimes that's life's way of asking you to build another home. And with that, Linda drove away from the ballroom lights into the rain and toward whatever waited next. She didn't cry on the way home. Linda drove past neighborhoods lit with porch lights and backyard weddings, the kind where laughter floated over fences and strangers waved at one another from driveways. Her hands gripped the wheel, steady and calm, as if her body hadn't yet told her heart what had happened. The silver gift box lay on the passenger seat, unopened, the bow now completely undone. She didn't take the highway. She took the long way, the roads that twisted past the hospital where she used to work night shifts, past the shuttered diner where she once poured coffee until sunrise, past the laundromat where she'd waited for her children's clothes to dry while helping them with algebra under flickering lights. Everything looked smaller at night, quieter. Like it too was waiting for someone to notice it still mattered. Her home was modest, a two-bedroom ranch tucked behind a row of pine trees, with weathered shutters and a cracked walkway that no one had bothered to repair. She parked, left the gift in the car, and stepped inside. The hum of the old refrigerator greeted her like an old friend who didn't ask questions. She toed off her shoes, hung her purse, and stood in the kitchen, letting the silence stretch. On the fridge, faded photos were held by mismatched magnets. School portraits of Ethan in crooked ties, Chloe in soccer uniforms, and Ben, always grinning like he had a secret the world hadn't caught up to yet. In the center was a drawing Ethan had made when he was 7. A lopsided stick figure with a cape and the words Supermom scribbled above it in orange crayon. She hadn't taken it down in 20 years. Linda reached for the kettle, filled it, and set it to boil. Her hands moved without thought. Chamomile tonight. The kind that helped her sleep, even if only for a few hours. She sat at the small wooden table by the window, wrapped her fingers around the warm mug, and looked into the darkness beyond the glass. It wasn't always like this. She remembered a time when her children's laughter filled this house, when there were mismatched socks on the floor and cereal bowls left in the sink. Back then, the days were long and the nights longer, but everything had meaning. Every scraped knee, every fevered brow, every school project at the last minute. Linda had been the glue, the warmth, the safety net no one saw but always fell into. She remembered the nights after her husband, David, passed. The quiet of that loss was different, quieter than death itself. He'd been her partner in the invisible, the one who knew that bills didn't pay themselves, that love was measured in casseroles left at neighbors' doors and hours spent beside hospital beds. When he was gone, it wasn't grief that undid her. It was the way people stopped seeing her as a woman and started seeing her as just a role. Strong mother, they called her. Resilient, as if those words were rewards, not cages. She worked 3 jobs after that. By day a nurse, by night a call center operator. On weekends, she cleaned houses under a different name just to make ends meet. She memorized every deadline, every tuition payment, every doctor's visit. She filed taxes and baked cupcakes. She sold her wedding ring to keep their lights on one December. None of them ever knew. She didn't want them to. Her love was quiet, like the hum of a refrigerator at midnight. Constant, unnoticed, essential. Ethan had been the eldest, the protector, the one who stood between his siblings and the world. He was the reason she'd taken the nursing job in the first place. "We're gonna get out of here, Mom," he used to say, his small hands patting hers. "I'll build you a house on a hill with a blue door and a backyard just for you." Now he lived in a condo with a rooftop view and a wife who never called her by name. Chloe had moved to Denver last year, chasing a nonprofit job that didn't pay much but filled her with meaning. She called on holidays. Ben was still in school, drifting between majors and cities, a wanderer she couldn't hold on to anymore. Linda loved them all the same. But tonight, sitting in her quiet kitchen with the taste of chamomile and rejection in her mouth, she realized something she hadn't dared name before. She was no longer anyone's first thought. They had lives now, real ones. With suits and speeches and dinner reservations she wasn't part of. She had given them roots, but they had pulled them up and replanted elsewhere. She didn't resent them for it, not really, but the ache was there, a dull pulse behind her ribs, the kind that came not from what was said but from what was no longer offered. She stood, rinsed her mug, and placed it gently in the sink. Her legs ached more these days, her back too. She pressed her palm to the small of it and exhaled. The house felt colder than before. She stood, rinsed her mug, and placed it gently in the sink. Her legs ached more these days, her back too. She pressed her palm to the small of it and exhaled. The house felt colder than before. In her bedroom, she opened the drawer of her nightstand. Inside was a notebook, blue, spiral-bound, with a floral corner sticker Ben had once stuck there as a joke. She flipped to a blank page and began to write. October 21st. Ethan got married today. I wasn't invited. I stood at the door like a stranger, dressed for a party I didn't get to enter. I saw my son smile at a woman who doesn't know how he likes his coffee. I saw him belong somewhere I wasn't allowed to follow. I sent him the truth tonight, not to hurt him but to remember myself. I used to think motherhood meant disappearing. I still do, but tonight I wonder, if I vanish entirely, who will remember I was ever here? She capped the pen, closed the book, turned off the light. In the darkness she lay still, hands folded over her chest like prayer. Tomorrow she would get up, do laundry, sweep the front porch. Maybe bake, but tonight she allowed herself to feel it. The silence of being the woman who once meant everything, and now was no one at all. The next morning came like all others do, slow, gray, indifferent. Linda folded her sheets with mechanical care. The weight of the previous night had not yet left her body, though it had settled into quieter places, behind her eyes, in her shoulders, in the slow way she moved through the kitchen. The toaster clicked, the kettle whistled. She ate alone. It wasn't loneliness that startled her, it was how familiar it had become. She was clearing the breakfast dishes when her phone vibrated on the counter. A message from Chloe. Mom, I think you should know, Emily's family posted the wedding photos this morning. Linda didn't open the link, she didn't need to. She already knew what would be in those photos. White flowers, polished smiles, her son Ethan beaming beside a woman with perfect teeth and an even more perfect lineage. There would be no sign of Linda Parker. No acknowledgement that she'd ever existed in his world at all. She sat down at the table again, staring at her untouched coffee. Emily Whitmore. The first time Linda met her was at a Christmas dinner she'd cooked in the cramped kitchen Ethan grew up in. Ham glazed with cloves, green beans with garlic, mashed potatoes with cream and butter, the way her children liked them. She'd brought out the good plates, the real silverware, and polished the table so hard she could see her reflection in it. She stood, rinsed her mug, and placed it gently in the sink. Her legs ached more these days, her back too. She pressed her palm to the small of it and exhaled. The house felt colder than before. In her bedroom, she opened the drawer of her nightstand. Inside was a notebook, blue, spiral-bound, with a floral corner sticker Ben had once stuck there as a joke. She flipped to a blank page and began to write. October 21st. Ethan got married today. I wasn't invited. I stood at the door like a stranger, dressed for a party I didn't get to enter. I saw my son smile at a woman who doesn't know how he likes his coffee. I saw him belong somewhere I wasn't allowed to follow. I sent him the truth tonight, not to hurt him but to remember myself. I used to think motherhood meant disappearing. I still do, but tonight I wonder, if I vanish entirely, who will remember I was ever here? She capped the pen, closed the book, turned off the light. In the darkness she lay still, hands folded over her chest like prayer. Tomorrow she would get up, do laundry, sweep the front porch. Maybe bake, but tonight she allowed herself to feel it. The silence of being the woman who once meant everything, and now was no one at all. The next morning came like all others do, slow, gray, indifferent. Linda folded her sheets with mechanical care. The weight of the previous night had not yet left her body, though it had settled into quieter places, behind her eyes, in her shoulders, in the slow way she moved through the kitchen. The toaster clicked, the kettle whistled. She ate alone. It wasn't loneliness that startled her, it was how familiar it had become. She was clearing the breakfast dishes when her phone vibrated on the counter. A message from Chloe. Mom, I think you should know, Emily's family posted the wedding photos this morning. Linda didn't open the link, she didn't need to. She already knew what would be in those photos. White flowers, polished smiles, her son Ethan beaming beside a woman with perfect teeth and an even more perfect lineage. There would be no sign of Linda Parker. No acknowledgement that she'd ever existed in his world at all. She sat down at the table again, staring at her untouched coffee. Emily Whitmore. The first time Linda met her was at a Christmas dinner she'd cooked in the cramped kitchen Ethan grew up in. Ham glazed with cloves, green beans with garlic, mashed potatoes with cream and butter, the way her children liked them. She'd brought out the good plates, the real silverware, and polished the table so hard she could see her reflection in it. Emily arrived 20 minutes late, her perfume arriving before she did. A waft of something expensive and cold. She kissed the air beside Linda's cheek and said, "Your house is quaint." Linda had smiled, polite. "We call it lived in." Emily had laughed, not kindly. Over the course of that meal, Linda learned everything she needed to know. Emily didn't eat meat, didn't drink caffeine, didn't believe in public education. She scrolled her phone under the table and corrected Ethan's grammar mid-sentence. When Linda brought out her homemade apple pie, Emily blinked and said, "Do you have anything gluten-free?" Ethan chuckled nervously. "You know, Mom, not everyone eats like we used to." Linda had nodded. "Not everyone, but you did," she wanted to say. "You used to?" After that night, things changed. Ethan stopped calling as often. Texts became shorter, more functional. Linda learned about milestones through Chloe. The engagement was announced on Instagram. The wedding date came through a forwarded email that was quickly retracted. Meant for Emily's friends only? Ethan had explained. Linda hadn't been surprised when the final invitation never came. She thought of all the women she'd met over the years: teachers, bosses, nurses, girlfriends, each one measuring her by what she had, not who she was. Emily had something none of them did: the ability to make Ethan feel like his past was something to escape. And that was her real power. Emily didn't hate Linda, she dismissed her. And dismissal, Linda had learned, was a colder death than hate. She stood and opened the drawer where she kept old mail, receipts, and documents. She pulled out the manila folder she'd labeled Ethan College/apartment/business. Inside were bank statements showing the initial $6,000 loan she'd taken from her 401k to help him cover his tuition gap, the leasing contract for his first studio apartment with her signature as guarantor, the first business registration for EP Solutions LLC, with Linda listed as co-founder in name only. She stared at the papers. Once, she'd been proud to save them. Now, they felt like souvenirs from a life where she still existed. She placed them in a new folder and labeled it quietly, just in case. Later that afternoon, she opened her laptop, typed out an email to her attorney, Melissa Chambers, a practical woman in her 60s who specialized in estate law and hard truths. They hadn't spoken since David's will. The subject line was simple: question about asset ownership. Linda typed, "Dear Melissa, I'm not in trouble yet, but I'd like to review some documents with you. Business, personal, and legal. Specifically, I want to know what protections I have if a co-founder relationship was never dissolved, especially if I never signed a release. Also, please advise on reclaiming investment tied to family ventures. No urgency, but soon. Best, Linda Parker." She hit send, then leaned back and stared at the ceiling. It wasn't vengeance she was chasing. She didn't want to ruin Ethan's new life. She just wanted to remember what it felt like to stand upright again, to reclaim something that had quietly been taken while no one was watching. That evening, as dusk pulled long shadows across the front lawn, she sat with an old photo album on her lap. Her fingers traced over the edges of a photo from Ethan's high school graduation, his arm wrapped around her shoulders. He was smiling, boyish, hopeful, warm. Back then, he still said, "Love you, Mom," without hesitation. She remembered the way he clung to her the day David died, 12 years old with trembling hands, whispering, "Don't leave me too." And now, she hadn't left him, he had. The next morning, another message arrived, this time from Chloe. "Emily's dad pulled out of Ethan's startup, says it's not aligned anymore, just thought you should know." Linda stared at the screen for a long time. The gift box was still in her backseat, untouched. She picked up her pen. In the same notebook as before, she wrote, "There's something cruel about watching someone you built walk away like you never existed. But maybe the real cruelty is pretending you didn't build them at all." Linda had never been the kind of woman who kept score. She didn't tally up late-night rides to urgent care, or the shoes she quietly replaced when someone's toes started peeking out. She didn't keep track of missed vacations, or the number of times she said yes when the answer should have been no. She didn't carry those things like debts waiting to be collected. Until now, the email to her attorney had been sent. The silence that followed was expected. Melissa didn't rush responses. She was precise, thorough, unflinching. That's what Linda needed. She sat cross-legged on the floor of her bedroom, surrounded by 3 cardboard boxes labeled in faded marker. Tax 2012-2019, kids' school stuff, medical/housing. It started innocently. A search for Ethan's lease agreement led to one folder, then another, and by the time the sun dipped behind the neighbor's rooftop, Linda had pulled out a trail, one dusty envelope at a time, that told the unspoken story of a life built in small, silent sacrifices. The first paper she unfolded was from August 2008, a payment receipt from Atlanta Memorial Hospital, Ethan's appendix. She'd paid in installments over 9 months, at 18% interest, so he wouldn't miss football tryouts. She laid the paper flat, smoothing its curled edges. Next came a series of check carbons: $1, $200 for Ethan's SAT prep course, $3, $000 for Chloe's summer art program, $900 to fix Ben's braces when insurance wouldn't cover the adjustment. Her handwriting looped neatly in the memo lines. "For you, love always. Next step." Linda paused, staring at one in particular. $500 January 2016, Ethan's business pitch flight to San Francisco. She remembered how nervous he was before that trip, how she ironed his only blazer and snuck a $100 bill in his bag with a note that read, "Eat something nice. First impressions matter." She wondered now if he remembered that note at all. As she sorted through the growing pile, she began to categorize, not by year but by meaning. Education, housing, health, business, sacrifices never mentioned. That last one grew the fastest. She pulled out an old flash drive from the back of the drawer, the one she used to back up family photos, plugged it in. There, among folders labeled Christmas 2012 and Chloe Soccer Champs, was a video file, Ethan College Pitch Practice. Mauve. She clicked play. A younger Ethan stood in the living room, fumbling with note cards, voice cracking from nerves. Linda's voice could be heard off camera, coaching gently, "Breathe, baby. Say it like you already believe it." Ethan smiled, tried again, stronger this time. She watched until the end, until he bowed theatrically and shouted, "Thanks, Mom." With a wink, the screen froze. Linda didn't move for several seconds. She copied the file into a new folder on her desktop. Receipts, not just financial. It was almost midnight when she stopped. The room was covered in paper and memories. Her body ached from sitting too long, but her mind was clearer than it had been in weeks. She opened a new Word document and began typing. Timeline of support Ethan Parker. 2005, emergency appendectomy total payments, $2 $749, paid personally by LP over 9 months. 2008-2012, high school support, academic plus extracurricular, SAT, travel, tutoring $4 500 plus. 2012, tuition at GSU $6,000, private loan against LP's 401k, no repayment agreed. 2015, first apartment lease, guarantor, LP, security deposit and first month covered by LP. 2016-2018, seed money for EP Solutions LLC initial funds, $2 500 from LP savings. No signed release of ownership. No dissolution agreement present. 2018, equipment purchased under LP name receipts available. 2019, loan repayment deferred indefinitely upon Ethan's request. 2020-2021, COVID hardship assistance provided. Grocery stipends, rent buffer, ESD $3 200. She didn't list these to guilt him. She listed them because love shouldn't mean erasure. Somewhere along the way, the world had begun to treat her like an expired coupon, redeemed too often, no longer valid. This list was her way of saying, "I was here, I mattered, and I will not disappear quietly." Her phone buzzed, a reply from Melissa. "Got your note, let's meet Wednesday. Bring everything, I have some thoughts, especially business structure and implied ownership. You're smart to document now. Most people wait until it's too late." Linda stared at the message. A small, unexpected smile tugged at the corner of her lips. She walked back into the kitchen and put on a pot of coffee. She'd given her children 100 tiny beginnings. Maybe it was time to give herself one. As the printer hummed softly in the next room, spitting out a copy of her timeline, Linda began to organize the documents into a blue accordion folder, the kind Chloe used to carry to school. On the front, she wrote 3 words in careful, even letters. For the record, the morning of the meeting came quietly, without drama, like any other Wednesday. Linda rose early. Dressed in the soft beige sweater she wore for things that mattered, and gathered her folder, the blue accordion file marked for the record. Inside were her notes, receipts, timelines, and signatures that told a story no one else had cared to write down. She didn't carry bitterness in her bag that day, only facts. The law office was downtown, tucked between a florist and a tax service. The kind of place people walked past without realizing it held stories of endings and new beginnings. Melissa Chambers greeted her with a brisk handshake, glasses perched low on her nose. "Morning, Linda," she said. "You brought everything?" Linda nodded, placing the folder on the desk, every paper I could find. For the next hour, Melissa read. Occasionally, she'd hum, tap her pen, or circle a figure. When she finished, she leaned back and said what Linda had both expected and dreaded. "Well," she said, "your documentation is clean. Too clean, maybe. You were a silent co-founder, but there's no signed release. That means you never gave up your stake. By law, you still own a portion of that business." Linda blinked. "Even after all this time?" "Especially after all this time," Melissa replied. "If his company used your initial investment, your name, or your resources, anything verifiable, you have a case. At minimum, a financial one. Potentially an intellectual property claim, depending on how the code or early documents were filed." Linda's stomach tightened. "I don't want to ruin him." Melissa's eyes softened. "You're not ruining anyone. You're reclaiming yourself. There's a difference." Linda left the office with that sentence echoing in her mind. That night, she sat at her kitchen table, surrounded again by the quiet company of papers and past choices. A half-empty cup of tea steamed beside her laptop. She'd scanned and backed up everything on her drive, on a flash, on the cloud. The folder, once private, now had weight. It was more than a record. It was proof she had existed in her son's story, even if the credits had rolled without her name. She clicked through her files, double-checking that every receipt and document had uploaded. The hum of the old refrigerator filled the silence. Then her phone buzzed, a notification she hadn't expected. Email sent auto backup complete, shared with primary contacts. Her brow furrowed. She hadn't meant to share it. Her online storage must have auto-synced to her old Gmail contact list. She clicked the notification. There it was, a message automatically shared with 3 contacts. One of them was Ethan. Linda froze. Her cursor hovered over the screen, heart pounding. She opened the email thread to confirm, and sure enough, the folder link had been sent. The subject line read simply, "For the record, Parker Family Holdings." She felt the blood rush from her face. "God," she whispered, pressing a hand to her chest. "No." She scrambled to unsend it, but it was too late. The timestamp read delivered. Across town, Ethan Parker was in his office mid-meeting when his phone buzzed. He saw the sender name, Mom, and frowned. They hadn't spoken since the wedding. He almost ignored it, but curiosity won. He opened the email. It wasn't a message. It was a link to a folder, neat, organized, labeled with precision. Inside were PDFs, receipts, and spreadsheets. His own name appeared again and again across loan forms, leases, and deposit slips, all signed by her. He clicked one file at random, tuition payment confirmation, Georgia State University. At the bottom, his mother's signature. Below it in the note field, her handwriting, for Ethan's future. Another file, EP Solutions Initial Capital Funding 2016. Transfer $2,500 from L. Parker Savings. Memo, seed money for Ethan's dream. His throat tightened. Then came the audio file. He clicked it and her voice filled the office. Steady, calm, and achingly familiar. If you're hearing this, Ethan, it means you've finally seen what I kept all these years. I never wanted credit, just honesty. You don't owe me money. You owe yourself the truth. You come from work, not wealth. Don't let anyone convince you that makes you less. She paused. He could hear a kettle whistle faintly in the background. I know Emily's world is shiny, it should be, but don't lose the part of you that came from scraping floors and waiting tables. That's the part that built you. And if I've embarrassed you by sending this, well, I suppose mothers always do, one way or another. Silence. Then a faint, shaky laugh. Take care of your name, Ethan. I spent half my life giving it weight, the rest is yours to carry. When the audio ended, the office was quiet except for the low hum of the AC. Ethan stared at the screen, eyes stinging. He didn't know what hurt more, the content of the message or the realization that it hadn't been meant to hurt at all. From his doorway, his business partner Mark poked his head in. Hey, Ethan, you okay? You look like you saw a ghost. Ethan blinked. Maybe I did. That evening, Linda sat by her window, watching the sun sink behind the trees. She didn't know what had happened on the other side of that accidental message. She only knew that sometimes life has a strange way of delivering the truth when you stop trying to protect it. Her phone lit up once. Ethan Parker missed call. Then again, voicemail 1. She hesitated before pressing play. Mom, it's me. I got your message, the files, the recordings. I didn't know half of it. Emily saw too. She's furious, but I don't even care right now. I just need to talk. Please call me. Linda sat very still, her breath trembling somewhere between relief and fear. The teacup beside her had gone cold. She whispered to the empty room, "You found me then?" When the phone rang again the next morning, Linda didn't answer. She had heard Ethan's voicemail, his voice thinner than pride, thicker than guilt. She had replayed it twice. And yet she still hadn't called him back. Not because she didn't want to, but because she didn't know who would be on the other end of that line, her son or the man the world had asked him to become. Instead, she swept the porch, clipped the lavender bush by the mailbox, and watered the tomato plants, now yellowing in the early October chill. The sky was soft with cloud cover, like it, too, was unsure what mood to carry. By early afternoon, Chloe called. "You talked to Ethan yet?" "No," Linda said simply. There was a pause, the kind only sisters or daughters fill without needing to speak. "You probably should," Chloe finally said. "It's complicated." Linda sat on the porch step, brushing dried leaves from her knees. "What happened?" "He stormed out of Emily's parents' house last night. After dinner, she called me sobbing, said he embarrassed her in front of everyone." "Because of the email?" Linda asked. "No." Chloe said, "Because he defended you." That stopped Linda cold. She said he yelled, told them all that you weren't some charity case, that you built his entire foundation and that they had no right to erase you. Said he should have walked you down the aisle too. Linda's chest went hollow, like the air had been knocked out of her, but not from pain, from surprise. "He said that?" "Every word." Linda lowered her eyes to her hands. They were wrinkled, dry, calloused from decades of holding too much and letting too little go. She hadn't expected to be defended, not anymore, not by Ethan. "He told them," Chloe continued, "that you were the only reason he could ever walk into a room with confidence." Linda swallowed. "And what did they say?" Chloe hesitated. "They said you were making drama, that you embarrassed him with that email, that you should have just stayed quiet." Linda exhaled sharply through her nose. Of course they did. She had been embarrassing for most of their relationship, from her modest house to her secondhand car to the stories she told too loudly at dinner. The Whitmores preferred women who whispered at charity events, not ones who bled for their families and kept the receipts. "Emily wants him to apologize," Chloe said, to her father. Linda stood, "And will he?" "I don't know," Chloe whispered. That evening, Ethan showed up on her porch. No warning, no bouquet, no script. He stood in the same spot where David used to stand, hands stuffed in his pockets, eyes cast down like a boy who'd just broken something precious. Linda opened the door but said nothing. He looked up. "Hi," he said, voice cracking like the first time he'd asked her if monsters were real. She stepped aside. He came in. The silence between them was thick, filled with years they'd both pretended not to feel slipping away. Ethan sat at the kitchen table, in the same chair he once carved his initials into with a butter knife. Linda made tea, chamomile for her, black for him, just like before. She slid the cup in front of him and took her seat. "I read every word," he said. She nodded. "I listened to your voice message twice. The second time I cried." He didn't say it like a confession. He said it like a man still learning what his tears meant. I didn't know how much you gave up, how much you kept, how much I took for granted. Linda stirred her tea slowly. I didn't do it to shame you. I know, he said. Emily thinks you did. She doesn't know me. No, Ethan admitted, and that's partly my fault. He sipped, then stared at the steam rising from the cup. After the email, I finally looked at all the numbers. I saw the papers. The dates, I saw that half the company was technically yours until I erased it on paper. On paper, Mom, not in truth. Linda's hands were still. You were young, I let it happen. But I let it continue, he said. I let people like Emily tell me what was respectable, what was presentable, and I made you small to seem big. Linda met his eyes, and now? He looked down again. Now I don't know who I am if I'm not standing on everything you built. Linda leaned back, the ache in her chest no longer pain, but something heavier recognition. You're still you, she said softly, but you have to decide which part of you matters more, the one that performs or the one that remembers. Ethan reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. He placed it on the table between them. I want to transfer shares back into your name, the ones you should have always had. Linda stared at the paper but didn't touch it. That's not necessary, she said. It is to me. She nodded slowly, letting the gesture speak louder than approval. Emily's not speaking to me right now, he added. Will she? I don't know, he said. She said I embarrassed her. Linda raised her eyebrows. Did you? He smiled sadly. Maybe, but I think I finally embarrassed the right person. They sat in silence for a long while, steam rising, time softening. Before he left, he looked at her and said, I'm sorry, Mom, for the wedding, for the years before that, for needing this long to come home. She stood, walked to him, and placed her hand gently on his cheek. Don't apologize for needing time, she whispered. Apologize if you never use it well. Linda didn't sleep that night. She lay in bed with the lamp still on, her notebook open beside her, pen uncapped. The room smelled faintly of lavender detergent and ink. Outside, wind pressed against the window pane like a restless visitor with nowhere else to go. Ethan's visit had settled something inside her, but it had also stirred something else. A realization. Forgiveness and boundaries could live in the same house. She had forgiven him, yes, but she also knew now that the only thing more dangerous than being erased by others was erasing yourself for the sake of peace. She wasn't going to fight Ethan. She wasn't trying to win, but she wasn't going to vanish again either. So the next morning, Linda did what she always did when the world felt complicated. She cleaned. She scrubbed the bathroom tiles, swept the hallway, dusted the baseboards. When the house gleamed like it did in the early days, when the kids were still small and every mess was a sign of life, she took a shower, dressed simply, and clipped her papers back into the blue accordion folder. She arrived at Melissa Chambers' office just after noon. Melissa waved her in without ceremony. I figured you'd come back, the lawyer said, eyes glancing up from a stack of client files. That timeline you built, it's the cleanest I've seen in years. Linda sat across from her. I want to proceed. Melissa raised an eyebrow. Officially? Yes, you're not pursuing damages? No, I don't want to punish him. I just want my name put where it belongs. Melissa nodded once, approval without indulgence. We'll start with a letter of record. A statement of original contribution and financial involvement. We'll timestamp everything. If this ever escalates into IP territory or equity redistribution, we'll already be ahead of it. Linda hesitated. Will it make a mess? Melissa gave a dry smile. Justice usually does. They spent an hour reviewing the documents. Melissa scanned them into her system, drafted the first round of language for a formal legal record, and explained Linda's rights in plain, unvarnished terms. Look, she said, tapping her pen against a document, this is what people forget. Silence is not the same as consent, and what you gave was not invisible just because it wasn't loud. When it was done, Linda signed two papers and placed her hand lightly over them, as if sealing something sacred. Back home, the house felt different. Not lighter, not heavier, just more real, like the truth had been spoken aloud and now lingered in the corners. She put the kettle on and, while it boiled, walked to her bookshelf. She reached behind the row of cookbooks and pulled out a photo album she hadn't opened in years. It was the red one, faded at the edges, corners softened by time. She flipped to the page with the newspaper clipping. Local high schooler accepted to GSU with honors, Ethan's name in bold. Next to it, a snapshot, her and Ethan, standing in front of the university gates. He was holding his acceptance letter. She was holding a styrofoam cup of gas station coffee. Both were smiling so wide it hurt to look at. She traced the edge of the photo with her fingertip. Built from scratch, she whispered, and now built to last. The phone rang. This time it wasn't Ethan. It was a number she didn't recognize. She answered anyway, her voice steady, cautious. Linda Parker speaking. A pause, then, Mrs. Parker, this is Deborah Slater from Langley, Hart, and Finch. We represent Emily Whitmore's family. I'd like to ask about a document that recently surfaced concerning Parker Holdings and early stage investment. Are you available to speak? Linda blinked, her fingers tightening around the receiver. It had begun. I'm available, she said calmly, but I'll only speak through my attorney. Of course, the woman replied, professional, clipped. May I take her contact information? Linda gave her Melissa's number, then hung up without another word. She stood very still, watching the kettle begin to whistle. They had noticed. The same people who once dismissed her as the background noise in their curated lives were now taking notes, now tracing their steps backward to the place where her name had quietly, patiently been waiting. Linda didn't feel victorious. She felt clean. She poured her tea, sat by the window, and opened her laptop. She typed a new document, a statement of her own, not for court, not for clients, just for herself. I didn't want to strike. I wanted to remember. But when you spend a lifetime being quiet, even a whisper can sound like thunder. To those who are used to your silence. She saved it in her folder. The quiet strike final. Then she closed the laptop, took a sip of her tea, and looked out the window, not at what had passed, but at what was finally arriving. The call from Emily's family never came again. Maybe Melissa's legal wording had been enough to close the loop. Maybe the Whitmores had simply decided she wasn't worth the trouble. Either way, the silence after that call had a finality to it. No lawyers, no statements, no apologies. Just absence. Ethan didn't call either. After that last meeting at the kitchen table, after he handed her the transfer papers and said he was sorry, he disappeared again, gently this time. Not out of malice, Linda sensed, but out of confusion. Shame. Maybe he was trying to mend his marriage. Maybe he wasn't sure how to build a life with two truths at once, the world he had chosen and the woman who had raised him. Linda didn't push. She had learned not to chase people into silence, especially not the ones you love, but the days that followed settled like dust in the corners of her home. She moved through them slowly, folding towels, feeding the cat, checking the mailbox with diminishing hope. The blue folder still sat in the drawer, untouched. Her name was now on record, her contribution acknowledged, at least by the people who counted. But the quiet afterward was different now. It wasn't peace, it was vacancy. House had never felt this still. Even after David died, the kids had filled the rooms with noise. Homework on the kitchen counter, music from Chloe's bedroom, Ben crashing through the hallway like he was always late for something. Now it was just her. Even the refrigerator had stopped humming right. It made a soft clunk every few hours, like it too was remembering what it used to hold. On Sunday morning, she went through the closets. It started as a practical task. Downsizing, she didn't need 5 coats, 3 of which hadn't fit since the second Obama administration. She found Ethan's old baseball glove, Chloe's Girl Scout sash, a box of Ben's participation ribbons, every one of them carefully saved in the belief that someday they'd want them. They hadn't asked. She packed the memories gently into donation bags, but one box she kept. Inside, a bundle of cards, folded drawings, a Mother's Day coupon book with 1 free foot massage, scribbled in crooked third-grade handwriting. She sat on the floor and read them all, one by one, until tears blurred the ink. She hadn't cried since the wedding. Not even when she was turned away at the door. Not when she sent the email. Not when they called her an embarrassment. But now, alone in the quiet shell of what used to be a family's center, she did. It was not a dramatic weeping. It was the kind that arrived quietly, like water seeping into old stone. The kind that doesn't need an audience to feel real. Later that afternoon, she made a decision. She listed the house. It wasn't impulsive. She'd been thinking about it since the night she realized no one would be knocking on the door for Sunday dinner anymore. The place had served its purpose. She had raised 3 children here, lost a husband here, and held herself together within these walls longer than most people ever noticed. But it was time. She called a realtor, filled out the paperwork, and scheduled photos for the following week. When asked if she was relocating to be closer to family, she replied without hesitation, "No, I'm relocating to be closer to myself." The next few days passed in a blur of cardboard and sorting. She labeled everything carefully: keep, donate, shred, memory box. She packed the wedding gift she never got to give, still wrapped, still ribboned. She didn't know why she couldn't throw it out. Maybe some part of her still believed that one day Ethan would open it and see it for what it was, an offering, not a weapon. By Thursday, the house felt hollow. Her voice echoed when she answered the phone. The living room, once full of life, was now just drywall and echoes. That night, she stood at the edge of her driveway, watching the porch light blink in the dark. She didn't remember replacing the bulb. Maybe David had done it, years ago, before the cancer, back when his tall frame would reach for things so she wouldn't have to. She wrapped her cardigan tighter around herself and stepped back inside. It was well past midnight when the knock came. 3 soft taps, barely audible. Linda had just finished brushing her teeth. She froze in the hallway, toothbrush still in hand. 3 more knocks, quicker this time. Her heart thudded. She walked slowly to the door, peeking through the peephole. Chloe, her hair was windblown, her eyes tired. But her face, the same round face Linda had once kissed goodnight for 16 straight years, was full of something different tonight. Urgency, worry, and something else, tenderness. Linda opened the door. "Hey," Chloe said softly. "Hi, baby," Linda replied, trying not to let her voice shake. Chloe stepped forward and wrapped her mother in a hug so tight Linda forgot how to breathe. They stood there for a long time. When they finally pulled apart, Chloe reached into her tote bag and held out a white envelope. Linda took it gently, fingers grazing the flap. "It's from Ethan," Chloe said. "He didn't know how to bring it himself." Linda opened the letter with slow fingers. Inside was a single page. "Mom, I don't know what to say yet, but I wanted you to have this before you go. I know the house meant more to you than any of us ever understood, and I know what I took from you when I made you feel like you didn't belong in it anymore. Thank you for building a home I could grow in, even if I forgot how to honor it. I love you, Ethan." Linda didn't cry this time. She just smiled, folded the letter neatly, and placed it in the box labeled Keep. Then she turned to Chloe. "You hungry?" Chloe nodded. They went into the kitchen and made grilled cheese, sat cross-legged on the floor because the chairs were already packed. And in that empty house, something warm returned, not furniture, not laughter, not even resolution, just presence. And presence, Linda had learned, was sometimes all you needed to begin again. Linda waited until Chloe had gone to sleep before she opened the envelope again. The letter was already read once, its edges softened by her fingers, the paper warmed by her hands. But something about the weight of it in silence after the dishes were rinsed and the air had settled made it feel different now. Heavier, truer. She sat at the dining table, alone, the rest of the room half-packed in cardboard boxes and old tape. The light above her flickered, and she didn't bother fixing it. It almost felt appropriate, like the house itself was breathing with her. She unfolded the paper, smoothing it with care. "Dear Mom, I don't know how to start this. I've rewritten the first paragraph at least 5 times. Nothing sounds right. Maybe because there's no right way to say I forgot who you were. When I saw that folder you sent, at first I was defensive, embarrassed. Then I read it again. I looked at every line. I listened to the recording. I sat in my office, in the chair you helped me buy 5 years ago, and cried into my sleeve like I was 15 again, breaking down over finals. I remembered things I'd buried, not because they weren't important, but because they made me feel small. Like the way you'd pack my lunch with a sticky note every Thursday, or how you stayed on hold with the bank for 4 hours after I overdrafted my first account, or how you called Chloe Peanut, even when she was taller than you. The truth is, I let myself believe the version of me Emily and her world wanted to see. I convinced myself that becoming more meant shedding the things that made me. And no matter how polished that new life looked, there was always this quiet ache underneath it. I didn't know what it was until I stood in a room full of people in tailored suits and realized none of them would have lifted me out of that garage in Atlanta. But you did. You always did. Emily didn't understand. Still doesn't. She thinks this is about money, optics, public image. But you and I both know it's about something deeper: truth. I tried to talk to her after the dinner. I told her you weren't a problem to be hidden. I said you built this version of me from the ground up, and no amount of strategy or silence would undo that. We fought hard. She said I embarrassed her. I told her, no. I finally stopped embarrassing myself. We haven't spoken since. I don't know what's going to happen next with us. I'm not writing this for forgiveness or permission. I'm writing it because I remembered something last night, something I'd buried so deep I almost lost it completely. That day at the science fair, I was 10. My volcano exploded too early and the whole table was ruined. I was crying behind the cafeteria and you sat next to me, handed me a napkin and said, "Sometimes, the thing that explodes is the thing that teaches you the most." Mom, I think I've finally had my volcano moment, and I'm trying to learn from it. I've signed over the ownership papers. Melissa said you'd get the formal documentation this week. I want you to know it's not about money. It's about truth and respect. I'm not asking to be the little boy in your hallway again. I know I can't go back, but I am asking if maybe, somehow, we can build something new. You once said you didn't need a seat at anyone's table, you'd build your own. If you'll have me, I'd like to pull up a chair to yours. Love, Ethan. Linda folded the letter again. She didn't cry. She didn't smile. She simply placed the paper back into the envelope, stood up, and walked over to the one remaining box in the living room that wasn't sealed. It was labeled, "Keep Personal." She opened the lid and gently placed the letter inside, beside a picture of Ethan at 5 years old, beaming from under a paper crown. Then she closed the box. She didn't need to fix everything. She didn't need to rush reconciliation or name what would happen next. Some bridges didn't need to be burned, and they didn't need to be rebuilt overnight. Sometimes it was enough that someone found their way across again. She looked around the nearly empty house, walls bare, echoes returning, and realized for the first time that it didn't feel like loss. It felt like space, space to plant something new. The next morning, she'd sign the closing papers and leave this house behind. But tonight, Linda sat in her kitchen with a glass of water and the moonlight for company. And for the first time in a long time, she felt full. The new place didn't look like much from the outside. A one-story brick building on the edge of a modest downtown block. The windows had been covered for years with old newspaper clippings and curling for lease signs. The paint on the door was chipped. A spider had claimed the corner of the awning as her own. But when Linda stepped inside, she saw possibility. Not in the walls, they needed scraping. Not in the ceiling, it needed replacing, but in the bones, the floor was solid. The light, when the blinds were raised, was generous. And best of all, there was a kitchen in the back, industrial with deep sinks and enough stove space to feed an army or a neighborhood. She signed the lease that afternoon. She called it the table. No subtitle, no mission statement posted on the door. Just a handwritten sign by the entrance. Everyone eats, everyone belongs, no invitation needed. It started small, a refurbished soup station, two secondhand folding tables, three volunteers, retired teachers, and one local teen trying to earn community service hours. Linda cooked like she always had, big pots, simple meals, ingredients stretched with love. Chili and cornbread, stew with root vegetables, pasta on Fridays. No one was turned away. No one was asked for an ID. Word spread fast in towns like this. The kind of people who knew what hunger felt like came first: veterans, day laborers, single mothers. Then came the lonely ones, the widows, the quiet men who used to work factories that didn't exist anymore. A few teenagers, a few wanderers. People came for the food, they stayed for the seat. One Thursday afternoon, as she ladled soup into a bowl, Linda looked around and realized something had changed. There was laughter now. Stories over plastic cups of lemonade, children crawling under tables, and old men playing cards by the window. A woman in a postal uniform hugged a man in a stained jacket. No one asked what anyone did for a living. No one had to perform. Everyone just was. Linda wiped her hands on her apron and stepped outside. Across the street, a banner fluttered outside the city council building. A local food bank fundraiser. Her name was on the list of contributors. Below it, in smaller print, founder the table. She didn't feel pride, she felt rooted. Ethan came by 2 weeks after the grand opening. He parked a block away like he wasn't sure if he should be seen. When he walked in, Linda was chopping carrots. He stood near the entrance, watching for a minute too long. "You gonna help or just stare?" she called, not looking up. He laughed, shoulders loosening. "Guess I'll help." She handed him a peeler. He rolled up his sleeves and joined her behind the prep station. They didn't talk much. The rhythm of peeling and chopping filled the space where apologies used to live. It was better that way. When the soup was ready, Ethan helped serve the line carefully, like it was something sacred. After the last bowl was poured, he sat across from her at one of the tables. The lights buzzed softly overhead. "You really built something here," he said. Linda sipped her tea. "I told you I would." He nodded. Emily and I separated. Linda didn't flinch. "I figured." She said she didn't sign up for my family's drama. Linda didn't smile, but her eyes were kind. People rarely do, but sometimes drama is just truth with its hair down. Ethan laughed, a genuine, boyish sound she hadn't heard in years. "I've been thinking," he said, "if you ever want to expand, the table could go citywide. I could help. Logistics, funding, platforming, no strings." Linda studied him for a long moment. Then she leaned forward. "This table," she said, tapping the wood between them, "wasn't built to scale, it was built to serve, to hold stories that don't make headlines." Ethan nodded slowly. "But if you want to build another one," she added, "build it next to mine, not on top of it." He smiled, and this time she smiled back. That night, after everyone had gone and the chairs were stacked, Linda turned off the lights and stood by the door. She looked back at the long, simple tables, the mismatched chairs, the scent of cinnamon still lingering in the air. There was no award on the wall, no plaque, no applause, but there was something better. Presence, warmth, a table that would never turn anyone away. She locked the door, keys jingling in her hand, and whispered to the dark street, "This one's for all the people who were told to wait outside." The invitation came in a simple white envelope with gold lettering across the top. Georgia Women in Impact Annual Keynote Speaker Nomination. Linda stared at it for a long moment before opening it. The letter inside was brief, formal, and a little stiff, like it had been proofread too many times. But its meaning cut through clearly. They wanted her to close the ceremony. To stand on stage and tell her story, not just as a mother or a survivor, but as a builder of something new. For a brief second, Linda wondered if this was some kind of mistake. But then she remembered, mistakes don't come with your name printed in embossed foil. So she said yes. The event was held in a mid-sized civic center in Atlanta, polished, high-ceilinged, air-conditioned like a hotel ballroom. Women from across the state gathered in blouses and name tags, sipping iced tea from mason jars and complimenting each other's shoes. Linda wore a green knit dress and soft brown flats. No jewelry, no makeup, just herself. Backstage, she clutched the speech she'd written by hand and later typed into 14-point font, large enough for her to read without glasses, small enough to feel private. When they called her name, she stepped onto the stage to the sound of polite applause. Under the bright lights, she saw them all: educators, caregivers, small business owners, nonprofit leaders. A room full of women who had spent lifetimes making things work without ever asking for credit. She took a breath and began. "A year ago, I stood outside the doors of a wedding ballroom in a lavender dress, holding a wrapped gift for a son who told me I wasn't invited." The room went still. I was his mother. I had raised him. I had worked night shifts and second jobs and sold my wedding ring just to keep his lights on once. But that night, I stood on the sidewalk while others clapped inside for a version of him that no longer included me. a soft murmur, some hands covering hearts. So I went home, and I sent an email, not angry, just honest. I attached a folder of receipts, timelines, and memories, not to accuse, but to remember. Because that's what mothers do. We remember everything the world forgets.